What's good, college football gamers? It's your boy Fen checking in for the first time as a YouTube partner, with big thanks to y'all for helping to make that happen for me. And I have a highly valuable video here on the best way to recruit in Dynasty mode in college football 25. It's easily the feature we've gotten the most questions about. Over 40 hours of streaming the game, 40 hours spent on the game mode, and then another 3 hours this morning of just experimenting on recruiting specifically, getting answers to some of our more specific questions. I think we've figured it out by now between me, the live Twitch chat, and the live YouTube chat this morning. We've worked out the kinks, and I've organized it all to present to you the best methods on how to recruit in college football 25. So to get it going, let's just start from the top with a fresh recruiting board setup in the preseason. A couple takeaways, especially that I learned between years 1 and 2 of Dynasty. I think it's best to target a relatively smaller number of prospects rather than just maxing out your board with all 35 of your targets, to be able to spend a little more resources and some more time in the form of your hours spend on that smaller group. So think like 15 maybe guys that you really want to add to the squad going forward. When you move to set up your board, you will be on the recommended tab. The recommended tab will kind of put together whether these players want to come play for you, good star matchups, good pipeline matchups, and we are using Ohio State here. So to get your board set up initially, start on recommended, but then more specifically, you can sort on this page by star rating to make sure that you're not going to miss any of the highest star players that seem like they're thinking about coming to play for you, okay? One thing to consider as you're setting up your board is your pipeline influence level. We spent a lot of time working out the kinks on this and figuring out specifically what's going on. The pipeline influence level is a combination of your coaching staff's backstories, where they're from, will dictate part of the pipeline influence, as well as how many players you currently have on the team from that pipeline. Initially, we were concerned that we would have to remember this information. I was worried that we couldn't find which pipelines your assistant coaches were strong in outside of managed staff, which is only available in the offseason. You can also tell their pipelines when you first load in to a dynasty. But the game kind of gives you the answer in the form of these pipeline influence levels. And you probably have noticed this by now. They go 0, that we can see here for this young man from Colorado, for us trying to recruit to Ohio State. You can see these 4s from New York and New Jersey. Obviously, the location of Ohio State not indicating that that's a 4. We're getting help from players on the roster, potentially our assistant coaches, and are rated 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 0. This will come into play because it essentially functions as a multiplier. You could think of this as a buff, where 5 pipeline influence will be giving you the most of a buff depending on your recruiting actions, while a 0, like we see here for Dante Bull, is not going to give you any buff at all because of the pipeline. So considering pipelines as you set this up, I start on recommended tab. Make sure you're not missing any of the big dogs that want to come to town for you. So I'll select through here. You could look at team need, of course, here, obviously, but I'm looking to start my year with somewhere around 15 targets. You can go a little more or a little less depending, but really my takeaway from my first year on Dynasty was that filling out your board with all 35 prospects is going to spread your net just a little too wide, and you're going to be a little too thin on hours that you could spend on these recruits. Go a little bit less. Recommended tab. You could sort by rating to make sure you're not missing any big dogs that want to come to play for your school. And remember during your setup that high pipeline influence levels will be easier to land for you than low ones. Not impossible to land in low ones, but it'll just be easier if you have a high pipeline influence. Couple ways, couple tips on how to set up your board in the first place, but really a lot of the good stuff comes once you already have your board set up, and that's what we worked on. Up next, I'm going to switch over to a dynasty that's like a week or two into the thing, so I could tell you some specifics on this, but those are some tips on how to set up in the first place. Okay, so I've switched over to one of kind of our experimenting spaces with this Texas Dynasty and this recruiting board to give you some specifics here. A couple things we've learned. Adding a prospect to your board alone with nothing else and advancing a week will reveal 2 of the prospect's interests of the total of 14. Outside of that, the next question we asked was whether or not it was a set number of interests that were revealed for each task. We were curious whether the DM would reveal X amount and the friends and family would reveal another amount. And we were looking for the concrete number on how many interests were revealed per hours that you spent. And we didn't get a good answer, but we found out why. The influence that you have on a prospect to start, plus the pipeline influence of that prospect, will have a bearing on how many of his interests you uncover. That is to say, somebody who you already have influence with, and you also have a high pipeline influence with, will get you more interests uncovered than the same situation on a player that you don't have influence with and you're not getting a good pipeline tier with either. So just side by side, higher influence to start and a higher pipeline tier will get you more information. It's not just a set of you get X amount per X amount of hours spent. Having said that, probably pretty intuitively, outside of that, it is just about hours that you spend. So hours that you spend, the more hours you spend, the more you learn about a prospect, with multipliers to be considered for how much influence you start with and their pipeline influence as well. So it's not a concrete 5 hours produces 1 interest. Doesn't quite work like that. The only thing that we noticed as concrete is when you add the prospect to the board and advance a week, you get 2 of their interests uncovered. Now here's where it gets a little bit interesting. After everything we've learned, the takeaway is that you want to make their top 5. The top 5 is a sweet spot because a couple things happen once they're in their top 5 phase. The hard and soft sell options become available, and you can also schedule visits. Let's start with the easy one of scheduling visits. You want to schedule your visits as early as you possibly can for a couple different reasons. First of all, they can only be in one place at one time, and if you wait too long, other schools will schedule them for visits, and if those visits coincide with your home games, you could potentially get locked out of ever having a prospect be able to visit because your home games are on days where they're already visiting other places, okay? And as the season goes on, obviously this is an early one for Texas, but the visit tab, the visit column, will show you when they have other visits scheduled. To that point, if you are losing to a school fairly handily, or you're fighting from behind, and they've been able to schedule a visit before you can schedule a visit, you could consider saving yourself some hours and not spending too many resources on that prospect. One of the many things that we've learned is that visits are your closers. So if you're already losing and they're also beating you to the punch on a visit, and you will be able to tell that because the week that they're scheduled will pop up in this visit column that you could see, you might as well save the hours and kind of bail out. So that's it. So get to the top 5 phase, set your visits as soon as you can. The other thing that happens at the top 5 phase and makes it worth getting to as quickly as you can is you have the option to hard sell or soft sell, and there's also sway. We've gotten the most questions about this, but we've learned something very, very important. And I'm going to give you the takeaway pretty much right up front. Here's what we've learned. Every combination of 3 motivations for a prospect does have a perfect pitch. So in this example, I pulled up Brian Worthy. Okay, if you look to the right, we know one of his interests is playing style, and another check that he has is proximity to home. But we don't know what the third one is. But we do know that there will be a perfect pitch. So now when we go to add an action, and scroll down to hard sell since he's already in his top 5 considerations. And we start scrolling around. We're looking for something that will match the 2 checks that he has already. And because I already know, because I'm using this as an example, I will tell you, the only pitch that has playing style and proximity to home included in it, regardless of what the third one could be, the only one that has those 2 in it is clutch. And I'll scroll around real quick one time so you can see. Playing time, proximity to home, but we know he already doesn't care about playing time, so that's not a perfect pitch for him. We'll get 1 match, we'll get, 1 check every once in a while here and there. The closest other one was the one we just saw with playing style, proximity to home, and playing time, but that's only 2 out of 3. Since we know there is a perfect pitch where you could go 3 out of 3 with his check marks, we know without even uncovering his motivation that this is his perfect pitch. Pro potential, playing style, and proximity to home, because it's the only one that it could possibly be. When you scroll around, you'll use process of elimination here. And this is an important idea to get because that means you don't need to see all 3 of their motivations. You only need to see 2, and then you go down to a process of elimination. In Brian Worthy's case, it's easy because there's only 1 match. Sometimes you might see, it might fall between 2 different options for the pitch. That is to say, 2 of his checks are covered, and there's a random third one in 2 different pitches. In that case, if it's still a 50-50 shot, but you want to try a sell, you would use soft sell. It's less of a penalty if you're wrong, and if as best as you can do is get it down to 50-50, and you felt like you wanted to use a soft sell, that's where you would use a soft sell. But in this case, we are clear to use a hard sell, which is what you want to use as quickly as you can. You want to speed run getting to the hard sell. That is going to get your best influence gain. And in this case, we know because of process of elimination that it's going to be the clutch. Here's another way that same idea can manifest itself, which I think is very cool. We'll click over here to Delvin Sasser, okay? We see that Delvin has a deal breaker. I wonder what the deal breaker is. Bottom right, we see his deal breaker is brand exposure. We have an A and he needs a B-. So we know that brand exposure is one of his motivations. That's going to be one of his green checks because his deal breaker is telling us that. He cares about it so much that it's a deal breaker if it doesn't work, right? So now when we scroll to his motivation page, again, we know that brand exposure is one of his interests. And now when we look at his motivation chart to the right, brand exposure is a question mark, but the deal breaker has already told us. We already know that from the deal breaker that brand exposure is one of his interests. So in this case, again, we already know our perfect pitch. And since he is not in his top 5 just yet, we can't do it, but we can anticipate that the next week, after assuming he reaches his top 5 for Delvin Sasser, we don't need to know anything else about him, although we will learn a lot more about him if we're still sending the house, but we don't need any more information because we know from his deal breaker being brand exposure that his perfect pitch is brand exposure, athletic facilities, and pro potential because of these 2 green check marks. To summarize it a little more concisely, you are looking to speed run getting to hard sell and being accurate with the hard sell. Your best case scenario is the first 2 motivations that you uncover by just adding the prospect to your board and advancing a week. Because remember, you'll get 2 just for that. If you somehow pop both of his interests and the player has a deal breaker, this is going to be a low roll chance of this ever happening. But if you went 2 for 2, you got 2 of his interests with the 2 motivations that you uncovered, and then he has a deal breaker that is telling you the third, you could potentially save some resources on that. As long as you make the top 5, you're ready to skip to hard sell as soon as you have that option, okay? Another question we've gotten along these same lines is what is sway? How does sway work? And to explain it, let's clip back to our guy Brian Worthy, okay? We'll look at, and let's look at his at the chart that we have. okay? So we already know from what we just talked about that his third check mark is going to be pro potential, which is an A+ for us. That's good news. Playing style is a B+ for us. Could be better, but it's still pretty good. But proximity to home, he doesn't love so much. So we could, if you wanted to, if you want to get 3 good grades for the perfect pitch that's appropriate for the prospect, you could use sway. This mechanic, here's how it works. You can pick which pitch you want to be his ideal pitch, right? Such that it matches up, the pitch matches up with his interests perfectly. You're essentially looking to change his mind about what he cares about. A couple of the moving pieces are, if he already cares about 2 of the things of the perfect pitch you're suggesting, if 2 of them he did care about before, you have a higher chance of successfully swaying that prospect and his perfect pitch. So this is his perfect pitch for right now, so we don't need to sway him to that. But proximity to home is kind of tough. So is there anything that has pro potential and playing style back to back? It doesn't look like it. It doesn't really look like it. So this wouldn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense for us to sway. But you can use this if you grade poorly in things that the prospect cares about to change to something you grade well in. You have a great chance of doing it if there's overlap between his natural interests and what you want him to be interested in. If he matches 2, you'll have a pretty good chance. 2 out of 3, you'll have a good chance. Matches 1 out of 3, you'll have less of a chance. And if you're trying to get him to care about 3 totally different things, you're going to have a very low chance of swaying him. But that's what sway can save you if a prospect cares about stuff that your school is not good at. That's how you would use sway specifically. So a couple of your primary takeaways from this whole thing. Set up your recruiting board in the preseason using the recommended tab to tell who wants to come play for you, but you can use square on PlayStation, X on Xbox to sort by each different column. I would recommend starting recommended, but then sorting by star to make sure any of the high caliber, high star athletes that are thinking about coming to you and have good pipeline scores, and they've just been, algorithmed into your recommended page, make sure the high star ones are getting a look from you. I would suggest setting your board up with a smaller number of prospects than 35. This can be dynamic, right? How many do you really want to land? 15, 20, maybe even less, depending on how many hours you want to pour into them. Adding a prospect and advancing a week will unlock 2 of their interests. From there, there's not a concrete base for X amount of hours produces X amount of interest. Instead, it's the hours combined with how much influence you had to start and also the pipeline influence level. And all 3 of those things are combined to see how many of the interests you unlock. It was multiple hours of testing before we finally realized that that's what was happening, and it was kind of a combination of things that was equaling out the interests. The top 5 cutoff is a sweet spot for you because that unlocks both scheduling a visit and also hard and soft sells. I would schedule a visit as soon as you can so you don't get beat to the punch by other teams specifically, and also use that process of elimination in a hard sell if you only have 2 out of the 3 interests to see whether you could start hard selling and getting that benefit even a little bit earlier than you would if you were to wait for all 3 of their interests. You can gamble a little bit with soft sell if you have to make a guess after your process of elimination, but a huge takeaway is that every prospect will have a perfect pitch. Their 3 interests will line up perfectly with a pitch in all cases always. There's no exceptions to that. Use that information to scroll through, see what pitches could be the perfect one for him. In some cases, it'll be more than one, but in a lot of cases, it will have to be one pitch. And even with the question mark on the board, because that's the only one it could be, to match up his 3 for 3 interests, you could know without waiting to uncover that information and move you to the hard sell a little bit earlier. You'll use the sway mechanic if you grade poorly at one of the things, one or more of the things that the prospect cares about. It's not a guarantee. You have a higher chance of a successful sway if there's some overlap between their interests and what you're trying to sway them to. If you're trying to convince them to care about 3 things that they didn't care about before, 3 of their X's, it's probably going to be a failed roll chance on the sway. But that's how that mechanic works. Do your scouting in the preseason, since that's all you could spend your hours on. And remember that you can see the visit schedule from other schools. So if you're losing to a school, they have a visit scheduled and you can't upstream them, you can only get a visit after them, you might as well consider saving those hours, not using 40 to schedule the visit, because you're probably going to get beat out unless it's somebody you really want and you want to stay in the mix and keep your fingers crossed for a flip later on by keeping them on your board. Other than that, you could probably afford to just get them off your board completely. And the good news on the pipeline bit is that the game does the legwork for you. You could take a look at where your assistant coaches are from and the players and whatnot, but it'll just algorithm a score together for you and rate 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 0, no pipeline influence at all. And you should consider that like a multiplier on all the other things that you can do with the prospect to gain influence. Higher pipeline influence level, the more information you'll get out of them and the better off you'll be. So I know this was a lot of information. I hope we covered how to set up your stuff, that top 5 threshold, how to use a hard sell, and how you could get the benefit of a hard sell even before you know all 3 of their motivations. Hopefully you understand a little bit better how to use the sway mechanic. Pipelines are huge, but thankfully the game summarizes it for you. And with all this put together, I think you will be able to skip some of these learning pains that I've had to go through over 40 hours on the game mode and then another 3 hours just begging for answers this morning. We finally found them, and I hope it benefits you in your Dynasty search. On to the Natty. Sign some 5 stars. Let me know how it goes. I'll answer any questions in the comments below. Hope y'all enjoyed. I'll see you in the next video, y'all. Peace.